Good morning, Senator Billow Kerrow.
Morning.
Welcome to the Situation Room.
Yeah, glad to be in the station room.
And as we start off the conversation, we just want to, of course, continue wishing our Muslim brothers and sisters, including yourself, Ramadan Kareem.
Yeah. Thank you very much.
Senator, you understand this matter very well. Let's first of all start by giving a summary of the article that you wrote yesterday, the kind of taxes that an ordinary Kenyan business has to contend with on a monthly basis, on an annual basis.
Yeah, it's unfortunate. We have a very complicated, structure of taxes in this country. In fact, one of the most complicated. If you look at the Income Tax Act, a huge volume, of hundreds of pages, you will have difficulty going through, and it's very difficult even for experts, the tax consultants, sometimes to try and address your tax issues. And this is because the government has been introducing one tax, system or item after another, and the whole concept of tax really, globally, is to make it simplified and to make it easy for people who are paying taxpayers to comply. This is why you find in this country default on tax is very common, and the penalties for default also very high. Now, businesses, as you know, government generates revenue mainly from businesses or taxpayers, and taxpayers come in forms of individuals or in forms of corporations. And if you look at any country in this world today, businesses, the reason why every country is obsessed with investment or with improving their business environment is that businesses employ people, and businesses are the ones that generate most of the taxes. A typical business you find in this country pays several types of taxes or generates several types of revenues for government. One is the typical one that we know of, pay as you earn.
Yep.
You have employees, they earn salary, and on that salary you get taxes that are paid, income taxes that are paid, to the government from the employees' income. Then you have the goods and services that you sell. These goods and services attract VAT. So these businesses are also paying substantial amounts they collect VAT on all those goods and services that they sell, and they pay the VAT to the government. Those two are some of the two major sources of revenue for the government. Now, a typical business also uses raw materials. Those raw materials, if they are imported, often have got a duty, customs duty and VAT when they come in, or if they are produced locally, they probably have excise duties and so forth. So you're also paying duty at that point. Then at the end of the day, when you have done your business, you have done your trade, you have earned some income, you make some profit. So from your income, you deduct your expenses and you pay corporation tax, which is another, the main tax that is paid, for example, by most of the limited companies. So on that corporation tax that you pay, the net profit that remains again, when you are paying to your shareholders profit, you again deduct withholding tax on dividend.
Yeah.
So there's a whole, lot of taxes and revenues that are generated by businesses. And so one of the fundamental things in the charter of any tax authority, including Kenya Revenue Authority, is not to focus only on regulatory aspect, but also to facilitate business, because that is where their money comes from. So in this country, we have a situation where the government has maximized revenue. I mean, it has looked for every opportunity to tax. The reason is because our expenditures have continuously increased. If today KRA, which is generating about 1.8 trillion shillings a year, was to double the revenue collection next year to 3 trillion, but this government, our government, what we have seen, would probably raise its expenditure to double that again. So the pressure to maximize revenue will always be there because of the challenges on spending side.
Yeah.
We've never had a problem really because we generate the largest amount of revenue in the whole of East Africa. In fact, KRA generates probably more revenue than all the other East African countries combined. Something in the range of over $25 billion. Not a small amount of money that KRA collects, but that is hardly enough. So that is the challenge that we we have. So it's the businesses incur a lot of this, but so some of them become really taxes that are punitive. And an example is this 1% minimum tax that we have seen. It's punitive because, number one, it's not based on income. The fundamental principle of tax is that it's based on income. For example, me and you, if we are not earning a salary, we cannot just pay tax.
Yeah.
We must be having some income. The same way with a business, if it is not having a net income, if it's not earning any revenue, which means the turnover less its expenditure, because they have expenditures for operations, their productional expenses, and so forth. So the net income is what is taxed, and this is clearly spelled out in the Income Tax Act. But the amendment to minimum tax simply says every company or every business must pay 1% on its revenue. So that is a challenge. If your company made a 1,000 shillings revenue, but made 100 shillings profit, the 1% that you're going to pay is 100 shillings, and you have made 100 shilling profit, but you're also paying 100. It doesn't make sense. So what we have been saying is that, look, this is really not necessary. If the government wants to address perennial loss makers or companies that are evading taxes, there are mechanisms in the income tax for addressing that. And KRA is there essentially for that purpose, to address those companies and ensure that businesses pay taxes or individuals pay taxes on their income. And there is a whole lot of a process for that. You obtain audited accounts, you examine those accounts, they don't rely on the self-assessment, they do audit, and to check the accuracy of the income and so forth. So it's not as if KRA does not have the tools to pursue those who are making perennial losses. But this minimum tax is actually not about loss maker. If you see what I've said in my article, the largest loss maker in this country is Kenya Airways.
Yep.
It's made hundreds of billions of losses, and they have been exempted expressly by law last week. So what they are targeting is simply to raise revenue on turnover. That's basically what they are doing, because even companies which are making profits and which have been paying tax, this thing affects them adversely, because what it says is 1% of turnover. So if that one is higher than the taxes that you have been paying, or the installment taxes that you pay every quarter, you'll still have to pay the higher one, which is the revenue. Yeah. So essentially, you're taxing capital. That's what you're doing, because if you are taking more money than what I have earned, basically you're eating into my capital. That's what's happening, and that is why businesses have found it very difficult and have decided to go to court.
Senator, people who understand economics like you do have always argued, and you've sort of like hinted at it, that perhaps if the focus of government was to generate more businesses, to ensure that you had a more vibrant economy, which of course by extension would mean there is more money circulating within the country, the issue of taxes would make a lot more sense if you balance it against this. Now, the question I want to ask is, what, in the circumstances that we find ourselves in, what are some of the things that the government could do to ensure that the business environment, that businesses are on the increase, that people who actually generate business and earn money can do more of the same?
You see, the governments all over the world, that is their primary concern, how to generate more revenues. And they do that by encouraging business. This is why the subject of creating a good business environment, or enhancing the ease of doing business, is a matter that every government is always concerned with. If you look at our budget every year, you can never miss those two terms. The government always saying that they're doing this measure or that measure or this policy or that one in order to enhance the ease of doing business, or creating a good business environment, so that the more business is coming, then the more revenue. Now, in our country, the challenges we have faced is that many businesses have collapsed because of course, COVID in the last 1 year. I'm sure that fact is well known to the government. But what government do is, for example, the fundamental things government do to encourage business, including investors, including foreign investors, by the way, is largely through the policy measures in tax. This is why, if today you are a foreign investor from outside, there's a whole entity of government that deals with how you can bring your investment into the country. And there are incentives that are provided. And those incentives include, if, for example, you go to an export processing zone or you go to any of the others, you'll find there are so many incentives, mainly around the tax. That if you come into our country, you set up business, you invest this kind of money, we shall exempt you from this kind of tax, and so that you employ people, so that you export goods and services, and we get money coming to the country and so forth.
Yeah.
But locally, what the government has also been doing, and the government can do, is the same thing. By the way, they have provided for businesses incentives, what we call business incentives, and this includes, for example, for a company, if I am doing manufacturing and I invest in capital equipment like plant and machinery, industrial building, and so forth. There are capital allowances. There are allowances. For example, whatever I have spent in building the industrial, setup in my factory, I'm allowed to recoup that one first before I start paying taxes on it, because I will have borrowed that money, or wherever you get that money from, you need to, recoup that money before you start paying taxes. These are some of the allowances which last year were reduced significantly, by the way. And so many of these measures that were dealt with last year were that type of, incentives, tax remissions when you are importing certain amounts, types of foreign goods. For example, if I'm importing goods for the purpose of manufacturing, and those goods will be exported to a neighboring country, that raw material that I imported, when I pay customs duty on it, I'm supposed to get some sort of a remission, because ultimately I'm sending this thing for export, and the country is also going to earn revenue and so forth. So there are a lot of ways in which you encourage. Locally, you can say, for example, the small and medium-sized enterprises. These are institutions that the government can support. They have talked about guaranteeing some of the loans that these SMEs will take from banks. But one of the things that, for a long time I have talked about is that central bank can play a significant role, really. And this, unfortunately, central bank has ended up being, supporter of banks rather than a facilitator of the economy. What they can do is, if you want to be a bank and you want to be licensed in this country, if central bank and the government says, okay, fine, number one condition is you must give 30% of all your loans and advances to the small and medium-sized enterprise. That's our condition number one. If you can meet that requirement, welcome, please. You can apply for your license and we'll give you a license. You cannot, you don't want to take risks, because business is all about risks. You cannot say, the largest, this is a subsistence economy. We are not a rich country like a developed country. 80% of our businesses are in the informal sector. Our land in Africa generally is not collateralized. So we cannot use most of our land for security and so forth. So we have a situation where you have millions of people setting up businesses every year, small and medium-sized enterprises, but they can't attract credit. And so what else the government can do, and which it's trying to do now, the 10 billion that they have said starting a credit, guarantee scheme for small and medium, but generally to put in substantial amounts of money to guarantee credits to small and medium enterprises. This happens in many countries, whether it is directly to agriculture kind of enterprises. If you want to encourage agriculture, specifically, that's why banks, by the way, like Agricultural Finance Corporation, some of these institutions in the old days, they were set up specifically for that kind of intervention, so that you can lend directly to specific sectors that you want the government to grow. The government can...
Just looking at just looking, Billow, at the operations of KRA, their job essentially is to collect on behalf of the government, is to collect tax. That's their job. Now, looking at more creative ways to then bring in revenue for the country. Obviously, if we look at businesses, if we look at Kenyans right now, we can easily say that people are being overtaxed. It's just too much, and there's very little more that you can get or milk from this particular cow. Can KRA be involved in the creative process of this if their job is just to collect? Can they be involved in ways how the government can make it easier on Kenyans and at the same time get that very much required revenue?
In the KRA charter, you will find that one of the tasks, one of the things it's tasked with, it's not just regulatory, but it's to facilitate business. I mean, you want to collect revenue from me, so you must facilitate also my business. You must make it easy for me to do business. You must make it easy for me to pay taxes. It must be simplified. So that mandate is there. But by and large, it's a mandate that most of the time the treasury is the one that plays that role, and they're the ones that come up with the tax measures and all these things when they do when they present their budget to treasury. But they do the consultations with treasury. I mean with KRA, and KRA has the mandate really. And let me say this: when I say it's simplified, it means, for example, let me give you this example. One of the most common ways of taxing is what we call indirect taxes. These are taxes which, an example is VAT. VAT, I'm not taxed directly. It's not on my income. How much are you earning, and how much profit am I making as a company, or what is my salary? It's not like pay as you earn on this one. So generally, a few years ago, I think this is about when 2003 or so, the government made a deliberate decision, and that was a policy decision, that we should enhance indirect taxes. In other words, focus more on indirect taxes and less on the direct one, because direct is more complicated to collect. Indirect is on VAT. So if instead of charging 1% on turnover, or many of these other taxes that you have seen the government introduce, on digital tax, on M-Pesa transactions, on you name it, every little thing that you do, there's one form of tax or the other. VAT at 16%, if you simply said, okay, we want to avoid all those indirect taxes, I'm charging 17%. It will be across the board to everyone who uses goods and services in this country, whether it's Kenya Airways or SGR or me or you or a farmer in Eldoret. Everyone will be affected equally, and everyone will be contributing. So then, because that is generally the form of taxes that makes it easy. And they did that, and this is why VAT went all the way to 16% when they started. But again, I think that I have to keep saying that the reason why the government has KRAs and the pressure to look for ways and means all the time is because of this insatiable appetite for funding by government. They raise 1.8 trillion, but the expenditure is going to be 3.3 or 3.6 or whatever. So you have this double. So they're under pressure always to look for
more.
So in that pressure now, you are looking for how to, hey, your shirt has not been taxed. Can we find a way of taxing that shirt? And look for every way. And that is what is making things more difficult. And I saw KRA, yes, they can be a bit more facilitative, and they can advise government.
Senator, you penned an article yesterday, and this is what we are focusing on today, where you're saying if the government had basically reined in on its own expenditure, then it would also be able to deal with the kind of revenue that it collects currently. Next financial year's budget, the indications are that the budget is going to be about 3 trillion shillings, and the National Treasury is saying that it hopes to collect 1.8 trillion shillings. First, will they be able to hit the 1.6 trillion shilling target for this year? Did they hit the target for last year? And what is it that makes them believe that they can hit 1.8 trillion shillings next year? But that is one question. The main question that I want to ask you is, what are these things that the government needs to do to cut its cloth so that it's able to basically deal with its own revenue collection?
Yeah, it's a good question, because that has been the question, and it's the elephant in the room. Really, it's about expenditure. It's not about the revenue. If you look at government, it's always talking about revenue, how to maximize revenue, how to raise revenue, but revenue has not been an issue. The issue really is how to live within your means. Now, KRA, the economy has not been very good. It's not been performing very well the last couple of years, and so KRA has not been collecting 100% of its targets. But that does not mean it has really been doing very well over 90% most of the time. And the last 6 months, for instance, they have met their target, and in fact surpassed their target in the last 6 months. But that is not where the issue is, because even if they collect their target, if the target is 1.6, 1.8, and they collect it, and revenue and expenditures, as we said, this financial year is 3.3 trillion, that revenue is not going to be enough. So you have a deficit of about $1 trillion, 3.3 less 1.8, if they collect 1.8, they will still have a shortfall of 1.5 trillion. So what the government has been doing over the years then to fill that gap is to borrow. That gap is what we call in economics budget deficit. The expenditure less the revenue, that deficit. And for a long time, if you look at the way our budgets used to be done in the past, let me tell you, specifically not just about this administration, but even before this administration, it used to be about balancing the budget. Budget is always about balancing revenue and expenditure, and avoiding a situation where you end up with a deficit. But the last 7 or 8 years, the issue is the deficits have grown to 8 or 9% or even more. And the government has always said we are going to deal with the deficit. We are going to bring it down. Even this year, if you look at the budget policy statement now for this financial year coming next 2 or 3 months, they've always said that they are saying the same thing, that we are going to bring it down to 3%.
Yeah.
But it doesn't happen. So what it means is that government needs to look at its expenditures. It looks at its operations, looks at its size, look at the ministry, look at the state corporations. Look at the operational expenses in general, what we call the recurrent expenditure, and in general, what happens is that there are misplaced priorities in government. That has been always our challenge. That we have priorities. I raised another recently. For example, I saw a huge advert in parts of this city, advertising on how safe it is to use nuclear energy. And it was being advertised by our nuclear authority.
Yeah.
We have set up a state corporation to set up a nuclear authority. And you wonder then, fine, okay, you want to pursue nuclear, that's something else. But why would you want to spend, hundreds of thousands of millions advertising, how to use, and you don't even have it. And so when you go around in government, you find many instances of wastage of funds and inefficiencies and that can really be so that is the challenge. Government, there's no control. Ministries are allocated money, but you find money being spent on things that are really not necessary. And so we have a government that is running taxis. They have a taxi, they have this administration alone has set up over a dozen new state corporations in the last 7 years.
Who would be responsible? Who would necessitate to come out and look at these issues and say, all right, we need to mop up things here and there? Because if you looked on a private level, it would be very clear what somebody needed to do. You have an audit that's done, and then somebody comes in and starts to cut things here and there, and then it's necessary for you to streamline certain things. We know that expenditure is very huge at government level, and sometimes unnecessary expenditure. And then it's clearly eating into other operations that could be then towards development and other such things. Who would be responsible for doing this?
Now, there are two levels. One is at the level of the executive, the other one is at the level of parliament. Let me explain. At the level of executive, they need to look at what are the priorities. For example, and I've raised this many times, it's not the mandate of a government to tax its citizens the way they want in order to do the kind of development they want. No. It's for the people to decide, really, how much they want to pay. And they do this through Parliament. That is why the power to tax is specifically given to Parliament. It's not the executive. They can propose, but it goes to Parliament. But the executive have one role. They can say, look, let us shelve this project. This particular development, for example, you want to put up an SGR. How much is it going to cost? It's going to cost 400, 500 billion. Okay, that's expensive. We have more pressing challenges. We don't have water in our homes. We don't have medicines in our hospitals. And this and that. Let's shelve this one. But if they say, no, I want to do this because I want to have a legacy. I want to do this. I want to have, as a government, we seem to have done ABCD. I want to have this expressway. And you borrow money. That borrowing money, there's nothing called a loan. The money that you are borrowing is the taxpayers' money because you're the ones who are going to pay that loan, ultimately. So that, number one, is the buck stops with the executive because they can really rationalize their expenditures, creating all these institutions and all these expenditures. Number two is Parliament, which has the power to stop the executive from doing those things. They are the ones who are mandated to approve every budget. Nothing that the executive does can go without the approval of Parliament. Every shilling that they spend, every shilling, including every policy or development project or activity that they have to do, must get the approval of Parliament. And this is where, unfortunately, when the Parliament then becomes,
A rubber stamp.
What happens nowadays is instead of things have changed. Instead of Parliament becoming the oversight of the executive, it's the executive who now oversights Parliament. That's why you find, MPs are now the ones who are being summoned every time, appear here and explain this and explain that, and so. But that is the mandate Parliament has. So if the institution was working, this is where now the checks and balances will be done.
Okay.
And government will be told, sorry, this expenditure is too much. You must stop this one.
Failure of the two institutions to do what they are supposed to be doing. Parliament not doing its oversight role properly, the executive not seeming to see that there's a problem. What then can happen? Who else can take up this action?
Is Odunga who can save us.
Senator, there's something I wanted to ask. If I look at what you're saying, and I look at taxes for what they actually are in essence, they have the power, two opposing powers, one to create and also one to destroy. And given the discussion that we're having, if we go by the article that you wrote, then essentially you're pointing out to, one, the negative powers that taxes have. Now, would you then say, for instance, that if we continue along this path, that the government through its tax system are actually abrogating certain fundamental rights that the citizens of this country have? Because with such taxes, if they're punitive, you can't create.
Let me put it in perspective. The KRA, Kenya Revenue Authority, is one of the most organized revenue administrations in Africa, by the way, and very efficient. They collect more revenue than I've said most of the countries in Africa. And actually, for example, if you look at the region, it's more than what all our countries in the region combined collect. They're very efficient. They as an institution, I mean, they carry out their mandate more effectively than many in the region. And we need the taxes. We need to pay the taxes, and this is why this country, to a large extent, is more developed than the other countries in the region in terms of many institutions. Look at education, look at even infrastructure or manufacturing or many. It's because the government, has revenues that is collected by the taxpayer. So we pay taxes in order to develop our country. That one is essential, and no one is saying taxes must not be paid. And this is why I pointed out in my article the many taxes that Kenyans are paying, which I have no problem with. For example, the VAT, the pay as you earn, the customs duty, and many of these other income taxes that people are paying. But what we are saying is that some of the taxes which have been introduced can be punitive because they kill businesses. An example is this 1% minimum tax. It can end up, because if you're already making a loss and you're being told you must pay, you have consistently made a loss, for example, in the last 3 months. Because of the situation we are in today, many companies are facing serious challenges because raw material costs have gone up. The cost of production in this country is high. Power is expensive, and so many things. So if you have made a loss and you're still told to pay tax, ultimately, and you have got a loan, you're financing, you have employees to pay, you have operations to pay for, you will come to a point where you'll say, no, sorry, I'm not able to run this business, and you close. And this is already happening. Some of the businesses are closing even without the 1%. You now ask them to pay 1% on revenue. And by the way, revenue turnover, it's something that, me and revenue turnover it can be huge. But in most businesses, they get a 1% margin on turnover. They sell volumes, and the margin on them are very small before you even come to the expenses. So I think they are punitive when they create a situation where the businesses are likely to fail in terms of servicing their normal obligations, their other obligations, and therefore, because of tax, they're not able to run and they close. And that's the punitive aspect. And this is one of them where Kenya Association of Manufacturers and many other players in the business environment have said, look, and I think up to 18 associations dealing with businesses have signed, onto this thing when it was introduced last year, that is going to be punitive, is going to kill businesses, and it's counterproductive. So there are these kind of taxes which really, are disincentive to business. So when it's the disincentive, we say that this is disincentive, it discourages people from investing. And then, for example, now the capital allowances that I mentioned earlier. I want to expand my business. I want to take 200-300 million loans from a bank to go and put up a new plant and machinery and so forth and so forth. I want government to help me in terms of recouping my capital loans and my capital amount outlay from the business before I start paying. This is something that is there all over the world. It's normal. And it's been, in this case, the same also in this country. From time immemorial, businesses, that is how you start business. But when you remove all these allowances and everything and you say, no, we're just looking for money every which way you can, I think then it becomes a bit of a punitive. People get discouraged, in paying taxes.
With the action that we saw, for example, from the courts yesterday to stop this one tax, do you think that if we saw more action like this on the part of those who own businesses in this country, individuals across the board, do you think that it could encourage, I want to use the word encourage as opposed to force, do you think that it would encourage then more creative thinking by government to find out ways of funding and also to maybe say, let's look in another direction and how we can make things flow a lot easier when it comes to then resources? Do you think that if you saw more action by, individuals, by businesses to actually say, we're not just going to take this line down anymore. We can pay what we ought to pay. But in terms of avoiding this punitive action by the exertion of more of these taxes, we're going to go and say, let this be stopped. Would it force government then to say, okay, hold on, we can't just continue doing things this way anymore. Let's think differently.
Yes, it ought to. It ought to. But from experience, this government has found a better way of looking for money. They borrow it. The moment you say 1% is not available and they have budgeted 100 billion to come from 1%, the following morning they'll just call up their friends and ask for a loan, and they'll kick the can down the road and you'll have to pay it some day later. But I agree. I think two things the government can do. One that it has committed many times it's going to do, but I think it's still doing, but it's not probably adequate, is to deal with leakages in the revenue collection system. There are still out there many institutions or many individuals or many residents who are not paying taxes for one reason or the other, and they need to gradually tighten the noose on and this is done through the enforcement of compliance by KRA, and that they have a huge department that deals with that, and I think they have lately been working quite a lot in that area to enforce compliance. But again, compliance, as you know, or enforcement is something that is always undermined in this country by corruption. The second that they need to do is to expand the tax base. There are many other, Kenyans out there or activities or, out there that are still not within the tax bracket that they can bring in, into the tax bracket, and, they expand the base so that it's not only a few. If you look at the number of people who are paying taxes in Kenya, you'll be surprised out of the 50 million Kenyans, the number would probably be around 2 million or so.
Senator, I have to interrupt you and ask, some of these sectors, because I don't know, that where people don't pay taxes, which are these? I mean, just for example.
Well,
the
I
direct
think
taxes, I'm sure.
No, this is a bit. Let me explain. It's a bit complicated. Our economy is largely subsistence economy. We are not having large. We're not dominated by Safaricom-sized businesses all over. So in this subsistence economy, what happens is that 80% of the businesses, if you walk into Nairobi CBD, you'll find in every building there are hundreds of offices and providing various types of services and various types of, whether it's accountants, doctors, lawyers, every kind of service provider that you can imagine, your garage, there are so many. Then you go all the way down into the rural areas. There's always an activity that is going on. There's ways in which, all the activities, all those businesses can be brought into the, without necessarily putting a very high taxes, but at least bringing them within to, expand broaden the base and bring in more people in, but at a smaller rate, people can pay taxes. And they have tried, by the way, when they introduced this turnover tax, not the minimum, but the turnover tax 1% for businesses, with income less than 50,000, 50 million, and so forth. So I think there are a lot of businesses, if you go into this country, that are small, but they are not all within the the KRA's radar. And I think so every year, those are the mentions they keep saying. You remember in the last couple of years, they have focused on rent, on those who own properties, and so forth. So I think there are. And then in addition is there's an area again that they have been saying they are going to focus on, but I don't think with a lot of success, what we call transfer pricing. If you look at most of the multinational companies, they avoid taxes in one way or the other through very sophisticated, and this is a global problem. But you'll find a multinational company here doing business, but the invoice is raised from their country, and the payments are done to an account in their country, and these things happen, all over, and so they have, for example, for a long time the real estate, which is one of the most profitable areas again in this country, was not within the tax or whatever. And I think a couple of years ago they introduced a capital gains tax, where now at least if you are selling properties and there is a profit on that investment that you are selling, you will be paying something on the profits that you are making on the sale of the asset. So I think there are areas where they can expand. Really, and there is room. And KRA itself is aware of this, and every year they're coming up with ways. But I say there are challenges. It's not only KRA but every institution faces in this country. With this. So some of those challenges make it difficult to enforce compliance across the board.
Paint a picture for us of what it would look like. I mean, we're talking about collecting largest amount of taxes in the region. Countries combined, and we've talked about what is not working. Paint a picture for us in terms of what it could look like if things were running properly, because oftentimes if we picture how it should be, then it could probably spur us on to aspire at least to get it done right. So what would it look like? What would be operating properly if the taxes actually being collected are being used in a proper manner, and then you're able to at least keep expenditure to a manageable level, at least to a dull roar? What would it look like?
Now, okay. If every shilling that the taxpayer pays is spent well, then you would see the results of that in this country in terms of not just infrastructure, but in terms of the economic development of the country. When the shilling is not that you pay as a taxpayer does not go to the right area, or is not used rightly, then you'll find a situation like the one we are in, where we are paying taxes more than everyone else in the region. But again, you don't see an awful lot of difference between us and others in terms of the level of, for example, economic development. And lately we have seen, in fact, countries that in the past were all dependent on Kenya's manufacturing sector. Today, if you stand at Namanga, you'll find there are more trucks bringing in goods into Kenya from Tanzania than are going into Tanzania. Uganda, which is our largest trading partner, used to be our largest destination for exports. Today, it exports more to Kenya than we export to Uganda, to the point where now literally everything, including even the basic foodstuffs, are cheaper when they come from those countries. And don't forget, all those countries import their raw materials. Some of these countries import their raw materials through Tanzania, through Mombasa. Now, coming back to your question, the issue is maximizing revenue. We're paying a lot of taxes. Why? Because of our expenditure. Why is our expenditure high? Our expenditure, for example, the 3.3 trillion this year, this financial year we are in, the government is going to spend 1 trillion to service loans. So then you say, okay, so actually out of the 3 trillion, we're going to spend 1 trillion, or rather 1.8 trillion that we're going to pay as taxpayers. 1 trillion is actually going to be used to service loans. Then you say, then what happened to those? What are those loans for? Then the questions come, how we use the money properly. That's always the question. It's about accountability. It's about spending. It's about priorities on those spending. So then it's a question that has been raised often by you in the media and everyone else. We take, say, $2 billion Eurobond loan. So the question is, where did that money go? Has it been spent? Has not been spent? It didn't go to infrastructure. It didn't go to infrastructure. Those are the questions. assume it went to infrastructure. Then the next question again that always comes up in this country is it value for money? We put up, we spent 2 billion, 3 billion on an SGR. Did we get value for money? Could it have been cheaper? Could it have been done at half the cost? Those questions again come in. So ultimately, then the situation is we are paying taxes, yes, but we are not getting value for money. The taxes that we're paying are being spent in a manner that is, there's wastage, there's pilferage, there's stealing, there's all those things, so that you don't actually find that on the. So when you calculate how much money, for example, let me give you an example. We're servicing, and you've said this yourself in the media, 7.8 or nearly 8 trillion shillings loan facility that we have. The loans that we have about 8 trillion. And so you ask, 8 trillion spent in the last 8 years. Where has it been spent? And you might say, yes, let's take a pen and paper and start calculating where all those loans went. So you start looking at, for example, let me give you the simplest example of the dams. The government put up, 3-4 years ago, they said they're putting up dozens of dams worth 200 or 300 billion shillings. You go around the country, none of those dams is complete. Not a single one of them. Yeah. And each one of them is worth 20, 30, 40 billion shillings, and none of them is complete. So you go around the country, and this Parliamentary Budget Office always publishes these reports. There are projects worth 1.5, I think, trillion that have stalled in the last 7 or 8 years, and nobody's bothered about completing those. So we keep starting new ones because the new ones have other reasons for being. So I think it's not about. So the good situation would have been one where we are paying the tax, and the taxes are used, and the citizens can see the benefits, not just on infrastructure and services provided by government,
but
also opportunity. Like now, when we have a COVID, they will also see people being supported. Small businesses being supported through grantees, on their loans or payment on their loans, or being supported. Those who are not employed, for example, Labor Ministry last week, they said the people who lost jobs last year, about 1.7 million, and they said they have applied to Treasury out of this new IMF funding of 257. They have asked for money. They want that money to be, if it's given to some part of the money is given to them, they want to send or give to those people who have applied for jobs or who have lost their jobs in the last few months, and they know because they have the database, all those who have lost jobs in various businesses and companies, and they want to support those guys by giving them a monthly stipend. That kind of, so if our revenue was well spent, you will see all those people who are employed.
Senator, thank you. Thank you very much for joining us this morning, Senator, and for sharing all those insights with us. We hope to invite you again soon. We know that the judge yesterday, Justice Odunga, just gave conservatory orders pending the hearing of this particular case, but we hope that it also goes out and it ends up this way, even in the final ruling and final judgment. Senator, asante sana, and we wish you a good day.
No problem.